Morning everybody. As a lot of you will know, one thing that I will never say about Steven Avery is that he was any kind of saint. I'd much prefer to use the word martyr, and therefore, yes, in the future he could very well become the patron saint of wrongful convictions. Back in 1985, when he was sentenced to 32 years, concurrent with running alongside those 32 years, you have to bear in mind, was 6 years sentence for endangering life and felony in possession. And that of course refers to the running Sandy Morris off the road, pointing a gun at her, inviting her into his car, which didn't go any further when she pointed out that, look, I've got my baby daughter there. If I was to leave her there, in the freezing cold, it would, she would die. And that it didn't go any further. But yes, quite rightly, Steve did 6 years for running Sandy Morris off the road, pointing a gun at her. And one has to say that when it came to the sentencing in 2007, quite rightly, Steve was then found guilty of being a felon for those 6 years, a felon in possession of a firearm. Interestingly, I was reading through the sort of sentencing by Judge Willis, and I didn't know this, that for that particular charge, Steven Avery was sentenced to 10 years, 5 years custodial, and 5 years on supervised release. And he notes that as Steve was arrested on November the 9th, 2005, and the sentencing was on June the 1st, 2007, that Steve had already served 568 days of that sentence. But of course, what's really strange was the verdict, wasn't it? Guilty of murder, but not guilty of mutilating a corpse. Because we're told that of the 150 questionnaires that were returned by the potential jurors, there was only one that thought that Steven Avery might be not guilty. And I don't think we have to speculate too much as to who that member of the jury was. I'm sure that was our good friend Rick, juror number 11. And then we find out that the initial vote taken straight after they were sent to their jury room was 7-4 in favour of not guilty. That it was, most people were quite happy that Steve was not guilty, or that the state had not presented sufficient evidence to prove guilt. I think that's the important thing here, isn't it? That it was up to the state to prove the guilt, and they certainly didn't prove any guilt. But then you get this not guilty of mutilating a corpse. A lot of people find this quite odd, quite strange. They don't understand what happened there. The best I've been able to find out was from an interview of the filmmakers. They actually touched on this very subject. That what happened, speaking with other members of the jury, in order to get a guilty verdict, a trade-off took place. Find Steve Avery guilty of murder, but not guilty of mutilating a corpse. And they were conned into believing that if they came up with that conclusion, that they would, first of all, they would cover themselves, because obviously some of the jurors felt that they were being intimidated, not least because you've got members of the jury with direct family connections to members of Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. But this conclusion, this verdict of not guilty of mutilating a corpse, would result in a mistrial. and therefore they could just wash their hands of it. Well, we're still waiting for this for this mistrial. We're still waiting for the for a retrial for Steve. I've always said all along I agree with Kathleen Zellner. I think once, and she's only had a fraction of the evidence to test that she's asked for and that she's entitled to, because Judge Willis made that stipulation that yes, in future all of this stuff could be retested, because in fairness, one of the things he does point out is the fact that Steven Avery was wrongfully convicted of attacking Penny, and therefore yes, the evidence does need to be kept for future testing, and points out that Steven Avery was quite right to plead not guilty and have the case come to court because of his previous wrongful conviction. So although we don't really think too much of Willis during the actual trial itself, he did seem to be pretty fair, but then that's easy to be charitable like that once the guilty verdict has been found and he's sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yes, once Kathleen Zellner gets her hands on other stuff to test, I can well imagine there being a Series 3 once she gets her hands on more evidence to test and an evidentiary hearing. A retrial, I find that very hard to imagine at all. I know that when Making a Murderer first came out back in 2016, we hear that the state of Wisconsin, through Brad Schimmel, had assured the Holbachs that they would retry the case if necessary. I can't see there being any appetite for a retrial once every single item of evidence has been shown to be bogus and false. Anyway, I'll maybe catch you tomorrow, but it'll be from Amsterdam, so looking forward to that. Bye for now.